One of the key challenges as well, is, for me I think, is this idea of the absence of doubt. I often think in terms of, with the left, while we're all sort of having a conversation and being critical and reflecting and trying to be fair and blah, 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 while we're doing that, the reactionary right are all over us like a rash. Yeah, they've already decided, and reactionary thought could be quite attractive if you're thinking about the culture of McDonaldization and portion control things and quick responses. Yeah, it could be attractive to people who with that culture. So the absence of doubt. So it's a great thing to have the absence of doubt and critically reflect, but it's also a key challenge because whilst we're doing that, the reactionary stuff is going on too quickly for us to keep up with. And I think something in terms of Gramsci that really, really sums it up is this idea of turning common sense into good sense. That sort of summarises a lot of the key challenges. And if a radical transformation is to occur in these areas, it's going to have to be, to use Gramsci's words, patient, obstinate perseverance. And I think that's a key challenge, which is why I told you those 3 stories about the laugh out loud and the activism via mobile, etc., etc. And the last one is a little picture that I drew about, it's supposed to be the picture of the state as a target bouncing around. It won't keep still, yeah? And if it would just keep still for 1 second, I might get a PhD done. But we do need to start thinking about the state as not a thing, but a process, and I'm obviously quoting from State Power and Crime here. We need to think about the state as a thing, not a thing, but a process, about, and this is where I get the boundaries bit in line with the conference, yeah? In shifting boundaries and ensembles, provides the arena for the organisation of social forces continually. I think I've brought some ideas forward about this, continually recodifying as well as drawing upon public and private interests and the moving target that is state power, which will frame our work nicely. Great quote from Occupy Liverpool to finish. I'm on time. Yeah. It's this idea of it's not a protest, it's a process. That was kind of a mantra from Occupy Liverpool, and I quite like that. And yeah, that's me. I hope it made a little bit of sense. Let's have a chat. Right?
Okay, you heard this woman, let's have a chat, right? Who wants to ask questions or make comments?
Oh, superb. No one? Okay.
Please.
One. One thing I've been working on, it's a different area, is looking at slacktivism, the concept of Coney 2012. So one of the things I've been looking at is that online concept of click like, do something activist. Yeah. And I wondered if you could expand on, just to give you a bit of background on what I've been working on, is kind of this concept that it does empower you with information in many respects, because you do get almost soundbite versions of material that you can then ruminate on, but you don't actually do anything with it necessarily. So you can build greater awareness, but that awareness may not translate into any meaningful action. Yeah. And there's a huge body of theory around slacktivism as a concept that's coming out of the US. So I wondered if you could maybe expand a little bit on what you're thinking about there, because you kind of raised it as kind of a quick soundbite on liking activism. But to what extent do you think that's impacted in the Occupy movement? Or, I mean, especially in the UK and American context, I'm thinking like there wasn't actually necessarily in most places a huge physical presence, but there certainly was an extensive Facebook action around it. My wall was saturated. Yeah. Everything was Occupy this. So what do you think that impact has? Do you think that that slacktivism kind of theory, that it increases awareness but doesn't necessarily increase action?
Yeah, I kind of completely agree. I'm not massively au fait with the slacktivism stuff that's coming out at the minute. Thanks, that's brilliant. This is what I need. Feedback like this. So I will check that out. So in terms of, I agree completely in terms of, I think I don't want to dismiss kind of social media in that way, because it does raise a lot of awareness and stuff. The Coney thing though, I think the reliability of sources and things, and just because you use that as an example, that for me was quite. The fact that apart from its reliability, etc., I think the most interesting thing about that was everyone was shocked, right? As if they'd just heard about conflict, as if they'd just heard about, and it was very kind of bourgeoisie going, get in here and see what the proletariat are up to, yeah? And it was just like, as if it was completely new, right? But I think it is really problematic. The only thing I can respond with is the experience, particularly of Occupy Liverpool. The division between the camp, the Occupy Liverpool was in two formats. It was online and it was a camp, yeah, and they were very, very different. And so I think it's actually, in terms of thinking about a divided 99%, I think there's an Occupy online and I think there's an Occupy with a physical presence. Is that answering your question at all? No? Yeah, no.
I just think it'd be an interesting thing to reflect on as well about that 9%, 90%. To what extent is the 9 and 90% that you've talked about reflective in that divide between the online and the physical presence?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's...
Because I think that would be an interesting inquiry, because all the stuff on Slacktivism talks mainly about the 18 to 45-year-old, usually university educated, tend to be the people who text message 5 quid to a charity, but actually never engage with that charity in any substantive sense. And as somebody who works on trafficking, child soldier, and that kind of stuff, it's quite an interesting theoretical lens for you to reflect on that quote that you had. And I'm kind of curious, and I have no idea, I'm just raising it as an issue. Is it that the 9% are doing a lot more of that slacktivist behaviour than the 90? To what extent is that divide present in those two different forms of Occupy?
No, absolutely. That's a really interesting thing to look at. And just while you're on that subject, I've just thought about this. There's two issues as well for me in terms of this slacktivism. Is one, I think it seriously distances you from the issues in many respects. It becomes this kind of, it's a video and it's not, you know, it reminds me of even the Amnesty International campaign about it's not happening here but it's happening now. And they placed adverts in bus stops so it looked like human rights violations were happening in that area. It's completely distancing. And also what's interesting about the divide in that sense is it distances, and I've forgotten what I was going to say. I'm tired now. It distances. Oh yes, and it's also doing the whole. It's pushing people to stay and consume stuff within a private space rather than a public space, and it's supporting that don't go in the public space thing as well. But that was really interesting and massively helpful. Cheers, this is good.
I've got a question, I suppose. I was struck by what you said that people at the assemblies, that people sometimes thought they were boring and tedious. Yeah. And I would have expected people there to be a bit more charitable in the sense that this was speaking out their minds for not having done that for a long time, or in that seriousness maybe. And that was, for me, that was an important part of, I was in the Occupy, I was aware more of the students before the Occupy, where it was, okay, I'll put it in a question for me, it's like, wasn't that sort of disregarding a crucial aspect of Occupy, which was be heard but also learn to hear other people and function in a transparent way in the assembly? Do you see what I mean? That if people are, it's the first thing, if somebody doesn't know how to, it's only beginning to express themselves and wants to be heard, then they'll be struggling for words and they might be long and like not go straight to the point.
So you mean if people are saying, oh, I'm bored, etc., it goes against the ethos of Occupy in terms of the inclusivity, in terms of listening to people's views?
Yeah, because part of it is to liberate people to, or at least in my reading, to make people, to let people reclaim the also public discourse in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and for me the interesting bit is that in that space you would think that would be the one place that people would be interested in wanting to listen and everything else. And I think my point about that was that the current culture that we're in, you know, really short kind of attention spans, and it's a barrier, yeah? So the possibility is, I mean, that was just an observation from some of the stuff that I'd read. It seemed to come up all the time, people saying they're bored and tedious. And I think it's just, it's problematic. I think it might be a barrier to people actually engaging in a meaningful way. And yeah, sorry.
Yeah, if I can come back on that though, from my experience, and this was a lot more prevalent in Greece, where it was where people just love to talk a lot but are not that good at listening. But from my experience in the listening from the squares in Greece, it was that the first time Greeks were actually listening to each other, struggling for words, but listening to each other. And also at Occupy at the beginning, it also, as the group gets a bit more homogeneous, people actually get the skills of being more precise and respecting the other person speaking and the other person's listening as well. So, you know, that's why I chose to phrase it as a lack of charity at the beginning. If people like are not patient with people, you know, coming out for the first time, because it's a process, like until you homogenize the group and you learn to speak in a more concise way, then the meetings, I don't know if it happened in your meetings, but in some meetings that I was, at the beginning it took 3 or 4 hours to take a decision, but then at the end we were really like, we were getting things done much quicker as we got to know each other and we sort of tuned into each other. And I think that was very important and a very promising avenue for also how direct democracy can work or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, completely, because I think what you've just, you know, what you're demonstrating there is the things that I've read have been those kind of quick books that have come out very quickly. So maybe they've, as you say, and I believe that would probably be the case, that at first it might have been boring and tedious while people got to know each other, etc., but then afterwards, so I would be interested, that's a really good point, and I wrote it down. In terms of the next set of literature that comes out that maybe talks about Occupy, not just at the beginning, that'll be a lot more evidence, I imagine, completely.
Can I just comment on this as well before we switch topic? This process that you described, when I participated in Occupy in the US, is something that I saw. I went to about 12 different cities to observe Occupy. And in the beginning, this is what it was like. It was almost like discovering, okay, because the process that was used was ultra-democratic, how do you actually do democracy? If you don't have somebody way up there in a hierarchy who's making all the decisions, you know, it's actually a bunch of work. It's a lot of work. You have to hear every voice. You have to make sure that nobody's being shut down. You got to look out for those gender dynamics. You got to look out for those, you know, race, ethnicity dynamics. You got to be really responsible about it. And it was a major educational enterprise. In some ways, I mean, I look at Occupy as it's trained a generation, or part of a generation, right, exactly, about, you know, how do you do democracy, how do you do effective activism, etc. It's kind of like the anti-globalization activities that happened in the US. It's like, it came and went, and many people are left saying, well, gee, you know, what was that about? We have no idea what the impact of that was. You know, was the impact of the 60s what the results, or was it how it trained and reminded people of democracy and all that? So I think that's a big part of the value of the process itself. As tiring, as exhausting, and frustrating. It was the same thing in the US. Half the people would get up and leave in the middle of meetings, you know, because they have this ultra-effectiveness, speed, fast food, as you talk about in your presentation, culture and mentality. And no, that's not how a democracy doesn't work that way. It takes a bunch of work.
And so just to chip in on one practical small issue as well, not a small issue, but you know the way they banned the megaphones. So of course people were communicating in like along rows, so it was like, you know, just going, hearing 3 words, turning around, repeating 3 words, and it was going back through large groups. So I imagine that was extra as on a practical issue as well, in terms of people getting used to that timing.